I'm going to quickly verify the Christie case details before writing, so the calm narration stays specific without drifting into invented facts. The Christie Mullins case rests beneath the soft weight of old paper tonight, and you and I sit with it in Columbus, Ohio, where a summer afternoon in 1975 waited 38 years for its truest shape. Settle in and let the room grow quiet around us. The pages are thin now, pale at the corners, and if you imagine them under your hands, you can almost feel the dry slide of old reports, the faint smell of storage dust, and the small hush that comes when a case file is opened carefully. We begin with Christie Mullins by returning to the north side of Columbus, not in a hurry, and not with raised voices. You and I are only reading now, turning one page at a time, while the lamplight rests on names that once filled a police desk. The place is Graceland Shopping Centre, near North High Street and Morse Road, and the date is the 23rd of August, 1975. The air would have been warm, with the ordinary sounds of cars, store doors, and weekend errands moving around everyone who had no reason yet to remember that day. Christie was 14, nearly 15, and she lived close enough to those familiar streets for the shopping center to feel like part of ordinary life. You can picture the storefront windows, the flat Ohio light on the pavement, the smell of warm asphalt afternoon, and the soft paper rustle of receipts in someone's pocket. In the file, these details don't arrive as poetry. They arrive as statements, times, names, and addresses. But when we sit with them patiently, they begin to feel human again. That afternoon, Christie and another girl had gone toward the Graceland area, and by the time the first urgent calls began moving through police channels, the day had already changed forever. We won't linger on harm here. We only need to know that Christie was found in a wooded area behind the shopping center, and that the people who loved her were pulled into a silence no family should have to carry. You and I can let that fact rest gently on the table. It is enough. The first officers had what investigators often have at the beginning of a case: a place, a body, a few witnesses, and too many questions. The woods behind Graceland were not a courtroom, and they were not a neat diagram. They were brush, grass, heat, insects, broken branches, and the uneven ground where shoes could leave marks and then lose them again. You can imagine a notebook opening there, the pencil moving quickly, the officer trying to preserve what the afternoon was already beginning to scatter. In those first hours, the Christie Mullins case became a search for order. Someone had to write down where things were. Someone had to listen to voices that were shaken and uneven. Someone had to decide which details belonged together and which ones only seemed important because fear makes every sound louder. You and I, reading years later, have the strange advantage of stillness. But the first investigators had movement, heat, pressure, and grieving people waiting nearby. One of the central figures in the first version of the file was Henry Newell Jr. He came forward as a witness, and his account helped shape the early direction of the case. He said he had been in the area with members of his family, and he described seeing a man leave the scene. From that account came a description, and from the description came a sketch, the kind of printed face that could pass from hand to hand across a city. You can almost hear the old office around that sketch, the scrape of a chair leg, the ring of a desk phone, the typewriter keys tapping a name into a report. A composite drawing has a certain weight in an investigation because it seems to give uncertainty a face. But as you sit with this part of the Christie Mullins file, you begin to notice how much depended on one witness, one story, and one set of choices made before the case had time to breathe. Police were working with the tools of the mid-1970s. There was no modern genetic genealogy waiting in the background. There were interviews, fingerprints where they could be found, blood typing, photographs, handwriting, shoe impressions, and the careful comparison of what one person said against what another person remembered. It was patient work when done well. It was fragile work when done too quickly. Within days, attention moved toward Jack Carman, a young man who resembled the composite sketch closely enough to bring him into police custody. He was 26, and records later described him as having serious developmental disabilities. You and I should slow down here, because this is where the file becomes very quiet in a different way. A vulnerable man was questioned, And after hours without the protection that should have surrounded him, he confessed. The confession seemed to answer the case for a time, but a confession is not always the same as truth. It can look solid on a typed page and still be weak at its center. Jack later said he confessed because police were being nice to him, a simple sentence that feels almost unbearably sad when you read it slowly. You can imagine the thin tape, the room air, the tired faces, and the terrible ease with which a case can begin leaning the wrong way. In September of 1975, Jack Carman pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. The file must have seemed to some people as though it had found its ending. There were still papers to process, still court dates, still lines to type, but the city could tell itself that Christie's case had been answered. Yet some answers do not settle properly. They sit unevenly in the record, like a folder placed back on the shelf with something folded inside it the wrong way. But there was one more detail in the file, and when we turn toward it, we begin to see why the Christie Mullins case did not truly rest. Christie's father, Robert Mullins, did not accept the case as neatly finished. In the years that followed, doubt stayed with him. You can imagine that doubt as something quieter than anger, though anger had every reason to be there. It may have been the feeling of rereading a line that never quite made sense, or hearing a witness statement in memory and sensing that a word had shifted. Families sometimes become investigators because love won't let the file close. By 1977, Jack Carman's conviction had begun to come apart. Questions about his confession, his competency, and the handling of the investigation returned to the surface. At trial, the old certainty weakened. Jack was acquitted, and he left the courtroom no longer convicted of Christie's death. But an acquittal does not automatically repair what has been damaged. It only changes the legal shape of the page. For Christie's family, the file remained open in the deepest sense. The person first named as guilty was no longer standing in that place. The original witness, Henry Newell, remained part of the story, and the case, instead of resolving, widened into years of waiting. You can feel the heaviness of that waiting if you picture a records room after hours. The fluorescent lights cooled down, the file box still marked with Christie's name. Cold cases do not always become cold because no one cares. Sometimes they grow cold because the first path taken becomes hard to leave. Reports are written, testimony is given. People move away. Detectives retire. Evidence is stored in boxes that smell of cardboard, dust, and old adhesive. And then, after a while, everyone who opens the file must also open the history of what went wrong before. The Christie Mullins case carried that burden for decades. It was not only the question of who had taken Christie's life, it was also the question of why the investigation had turned so firmly toward Jack Carman, and why Henry Newell had not been examined more closely when the case was still fresh. You and I can sit with that without accusation in our voices. We can simply observe how patient detective work sometimes means returning to the place where certainty began too soon. Years passed, and the city changed around Graceland. Stores changed names. Roads carried different cars. People who had been young in 1975 grew older, and the sound of the original case faded from daily conversation. But in the quiet way cold cases have, Christie's file remained somewhere in the structure of the police department. It waited behind newer files, newer names, newer calls, and the daily machinery of a city that never stops producing paper. When we read a cold case file, we are also reading time. A fresh report has sharp edges, an old report has softened corners. Ink fades, staple marks rust, photographs develop a yellow cast, and the faces in them seem to look out from a room that no longer exists. You may notice, as we move through Christie's case, that the most important evidence is not always hidden. Sometimes it has been visible for years, waiting for someone to ask a calmer question. And that is what began to happen slowly, as the decades carried the Christie Mullins case toward another reading. By the time the case reached the 21st century, there were people outside the original investigation who had begun looking closely at the old record. One of them was John Oller, an attorney and author who studied the Christie Mullins case in depth. You can picture him not as someone rushing toward a revelation, but as a reader at a desk, comparing statements, timelines, and the small contradictions that had survived in print. Patient work often looks like that. It looks like rereading. Oller's work drew renewed attention to questions that had never been comfortably answered. Why had the first witness account been accepted with such confidence? What could be made of Henry Newell's own actions and statements? How had Jack Carman's confession been obtained? And why had it become so persuasive despite his vulnerabilities? These questions were not loud. They were steady, and steady questions can change a case. Around the same long season, a new voice came forward from within Henry Newell's own family. Anne Brown, his niece, said that Newell had confessed to her years earlier. By then, Newell had died of cancer in 2013, 38 years after Christie's death. The timing is part of why this case is often remembered through that number. 38 years had passed before the silence around him began to break in a way investigators could no longer ignore. You can imagine what it feels like to receive a statement like that after so long. The office is modern now, but the file is old. There may be a computer on the desk, but beside it there are paper folders from 1975, and the smell of aging cardboard still rises when the lid comes off the box. A cold case detective has to hold both times at once, the present voice on the phone and the old summer day waiting inside the record. A family confession by itself is not enough to close a case with care. Memories can blur, people can misunderstand. Grief and rumor can travel through a family for years, changing shape as they go. So the work had to be slow again. Investigators had to compare Pam Brown's account with what was already known, and with what could still be tested or verified after so many seasons had passed over the evidence. That is the patient part of the Christie Mullins case that matters tonight. Solving it was not a single bright moment. It was not one dramatic clue placed in the center of a table. It was a return to the witness statement, the old confession, the physical evidence, the family account, and the long shadow of a man who had stood near the beginning of the case as though he were only helping. When the next box came down from the shelf, the old role of Henry Newell began to look different under quieter light. Newell had not been an unknown stranger drifting near the edge of the story. He had been there from the start, speaking to police, giving a description, shaping the sketch that later drew attention toward Jack Carman. That is the first thing you notice when you sit with this chapter of the file. The person who helped create the official picture of the suspect had also placed himself close to the scene. In many investigations, witnesses are treated with care because witnesses can preserve truth. But they also have to be tested because a witness statement is not a sacred object. It is a human account, made of memory, fear, self-protection, confusion, or sometimes calculation. You and I can feel the weight of that distinction as we read. The paper is thin, but the consequences were heavy. Newell's account included details that later seemed troubling. Investigators reviewing the case saw inconsistencies and gaps, and they considered whether his story had done more than describe events. It may have directed attention away from himself. That kind of possibility is difficult to hold, because it means the investigation may have been guided from the beginning by someone who had reason to mislead it. There were also questions about Newell's history. Records and later reporting described a background that should have made investigators look more closely at him in 1975. But the early case moved elsewhere. The sketch moved through newspapers. Jack Carman was stopped, questioned, and charged. The old machinery of certainty began turning, and once it was turning, it carried the file away from the person who had first pointed. You can almost feel the cold case units slowing that machinery down decades later. They were not standing in the wooded area on a hot August afternoon anymore. They were seated with reports, photographs, old lab notes, and the knowledge that every early mistake had become part of the evidence landscape. There is a particular patience required for that kind of work. It asks investigators to question not only suspects, but the investigation itself. The Christie Mullins case was eventually reviewed by the Columbus Police Cold Case Squad. Sergeant Eric Pillier, who led that unit, became one of the names connected with the formal closing of the case. By then, the work was partly forensic and partly historical. Detectives had to ask what remained testable, what remained reliable, and what had been overlooked because the first conclusion arrived too soon. Old evidence has its own atmosphere. You can imagine sealed envelopes, stiff labels, inventory sheets, and the careful sound of gloved hands moving items that had been stored for decades. There is no glamour in it, There is only responsibility. A cold case detective knows that a misplaced assumption can live longer than any one career, and that correcting it may require humility as much as skill. Years later, something shifted in the file, and the Christie Mullins case began to move towards the answer that had waited behind the first one. By the time cold case detectives came back to Christie Mullins, the world around the original investigation had become quieter in one sense and louder in another. There were more tools, more databases, more careful ways to preserve old evidence, and yet the central work still required a person to sit down and read. You can imagine a detective leaning over a table where the past has been spread out in folders, each page giving off that faint, dry smell of old ink and stored paper. The first thing we notice, sitting there with the Christie Mullins case, is how much of the answer had always been near the beginning. Henry Newell was not found through a distant search or a new stranger's name. He was already printed in the early reports. His words had already shaped the sketch. His presence had already touched the scene. It is a humbling thing when a cold case begins to suggest that the unknown person was never very far away. You turn the page slowly, because this is not only a story about finding the right name. It is also a story about seeing how the wrong name stayed in the file so long. Jack Carman's confession had created a kind of shadow, and even after his acquittal, that shadow remained over the official memory of the case. The record no longer said he was legally guilty, but the deeper work of understanding what had happened to Christie was still incomplete. A cold case detective has to move through those shadows carefully. The room might be ordinary, with coffee cooling in a paper cup and the air conditioner humming above the ceiling tiles, but the work inside the room is delicate. You are not only asking who committed the crime, you are asking how the investigation looked away and how it can now look back without damaging the truth a second time. In the Christie Mullins case, that meant reading the old statements with new patience. It meant asking how Henry Newell described what he said he saw, and whether his account made sense against the other known details. It meant looking at where he said he was, who was with him, how quickly he reported what he claimed to have witnessed, and what kind of description he gave when police were trying to form a picture of a suspect. You can hear the file breathing a little under that kind of attention. A name that once appeared in the witness column begins to stand differently on the page. A description that once seemed useful begins to look convenient. The sketch that once focused the search begins to feel less like a window and more like a curtain. None of this has to be spoken dramatically. It is enough to let each detail find its proper weight. The patience here belongs not only to the detectives, but also to the people who refused to let the record stay simple. Christie's family had waited for years, with an answer that did not satisfy them. Jack Carman had lived under the memory of an accusation that should never have found him so easily. And in the background, quiet advocates, writers, and investigators kept returning to the same difficult question. What had the file missed when it first chose its direction? You and I sit with that question for a while because it is part of the work. It asks us to imagine the original detectives as people under pressure, not as cardboard figures in an old report. They had a grieving family, a city watching, and a vulnerable case that needed movement. But pressure can narrow a room. It can make one path look brighter than the others, especially when a confession seems to close the circle. The old interrogation room is difficult to picture gently, but we can keep our focus on the record rather than the pressure of the moment. There would have been chairs, a table, stale air, and the low murmur of official voices. Jack Carman was not equipped to carry the weight placed on him. When you read later accounts of his confession, you can feel the mismatch between the seriousness of the case and the vulnerability of the person being questioned. That mismatch matters in the Christie Mullins case, because wrongful suspicion does not vanish just because a conviction is undone. It leaves traces. It leaves years. It leaves a family still searching and a man still carrying something he should never have been made to carry. Patient detective work, when it returns honestly to a cold case, has to be willing to name that harm without making the whole story about institutional pride. Across the years, the case remained in that unsettled position, half known and not fully answered, while Henry Newell lived out his life elsewhere in the ordinary world. That is one of the strangest things about old cases. While the file sits in a cabinet, people continue going to work, buying groceries, answering phones, and growing older. The shelves stay still. The lives around them do not. You can imagine Graceland changing season by season. Leaves gathered at curbs, rain darkened the pavement, summer heat returned and faded, and traffic moved past places where most people no longer knew what had happened. A shopping center is made for errands, not remembrance. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of storefronts and parking lots, Christie Mullins remained tied to that place in the memory of those who had loved her and those who had studied the file. When Henry Newell died in 2013, it did not end the need for truth. In some ways, it changed the kind of truth that was possible. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no courtroom where the evidence could be placed before a jury. What remained was the careful work of determining whether the case could be closed responsibly, and whether the name long hidden in plain sight could finally be spoken plainly. That is where Pam Brown's account becomes important. She was Henry Newell's niece, and she told investigators that Newell had confessed to her. You and I can hold that moment softly, because family disclosures often come wrapped in fear, delay, loyalty, and the ache of not knowing what to do with a terrible thing. A confession inside a family does not arrive like a polished statement. It arrives as memory, atmosphere, and burden. Imagine sitting across from someone who has carried such a memory for years. There is the sound of the recorder, the small click of a pen, the slight roughness of a tissue folded in someone's hand. The detective listens, not interrupting too quickly, because every word may matter. In a cold case, listening is often the first tool. It is also the oldest one. Pam Brown's statement did not stand alone. That is important. It had to be set beside other pieces, the way you might place old photographs on a table and look for how the edges line up. Her account pointed toward Henry Newell, but the file already contained reasons to look that way. He had been present at the beginning, he had given the description, he had helped police see someone else. The old case and the new statement began to speak to each other. This is how the Christie Mullins case moved after 38 years. Not with a single locked door opening all at once, but with one old latch easing, then another. The niece's account gave investigators a reason to return to Newell with new seriousness. The original record gave that account support, and the history of Jack Carman's wrongful confession showed why the first official answer could not be trusted. You can feel the tempo of this work if you imagine the detective's desk late in the day. Outside, the light changes on the windows. Inside, the file stays open. A page from 1975 lies beside a modern report. An old witness name appears again in fresh ink. The past is not revived loudly. It is reassembled quietly, piece by piece, until a different picture begins to hold. There is something almost tender about the way cold case work depends on small continuities. A file number still readable, a photograph still preserved, a family member still willing to speak, a detective still willing to admit that the first answer may have failed. You and I can let those continuities guide us. They remind us that justice is not always fast, and when it comes late, it often arrives on tired paper. In 2015, Columbus police formally announced that they believed Henry Newell had killed Christie Mullins. By then, Newell had been dead for about 2 years, and Jack Carman had long since been acquitted. The announcement did not bring the kind of ending a courtroom might have promised. It brought something quieter and more complicated. It brought correction, acknowledgement, and a name placed where investigators now believed it had belonged from the beginning. But before we sit with that announcement, we return once more to the old evidence, because the Christie Mullins case asks us to understand how patient review changes the meaning of what was already there. Evidence is not always silent, but it can be misunderstood. In the early days of a case, a piece of evidence may be read in one direction because investigators have already begun imagining a certain shape. Later, when that shape weakens, the same evidence may become newly important. This does not mean the evidence changed. It means the questions changed, and questions are the lanterns we carry into an old file. You might notice, as we sit with Christie's case, how often the answer depends on the order in which people listened. First, they listened to Henry Newell as a witness. Then, they listened to Jack Carman as a suspect. Years later, they listened again to people who said Newell had spoken differently in private. Each act of listening shaped the file, and the final review depended on hearing the older voices without being bound by the first interpretation. The tools available to cold case investigators in 2015 were better than those available in 1975. But this was not a case solved by a glittering laboratory moment alone. It was solved through context, reconsideration, witness history, and the courage to unwind an old mistake. That makes it especially human. The answer was not hidden in machinery, it was hidden partly in assumption. Assumption has a texture in a case file. It feels like a sentence that gets repeated from one report to the next. It looks like a name written under the same heading again and again, until no one remembers who first put it there. It settles like dust on a shelf, and when you wipe that dust away years later, you may find that the original surface was different than people thought. In Christie's file, the old assumption had been that Jack Carman's confession carried the truth. Once that began to fail, investigators needed to look again at the person whose account had helped make Jack look like the answer. Henry Newell's position changed under that review. He was no longer just a man who had reported something. He became a man whose reporting had to be examined as part of the mystery itself. You can picture the cold case detectives marking passages, comparing times, and holding one report beside another. Maybe there is a photocopy with a dark margin, or a yellow legal pad with names in careful columns. The work is quiet enough that someone walking past the office might not notice anything important happening. Yet inside that quiet, the old case is being corrected. There is a particular kind of patience required when the person believed responsible is no longer alive. Investigators cannot ask him the remaining questions. They cannot watch his face when a contradiction is raised. They cannot seek a courtroom confession or hear a defense attorney test each claim in open court. The case must be built from what remains, and what remains must be treated with care. That care matters because closing a case after so many years is also an act of public memory. When police say that a dead man is responsible, the statement cannot be casual. It carries weight for the victim's family, for the accused person's surviving family, for the wrongly suspected person, and for everyone who remembers the case from the earlier telling. You and I should feel that weight without letting it become heavy in our voices. For Christie's family, the naming of Henry Newell answered a question that had shaped nearly 4 decades. It did not return what was lost. It did not undo the years. But it gave them a clearer place to set their grief. Sometimes that is what a solved cold case can offer. Not peace in the simple sense, but a more honest map of what happened, and a release from being asked to accept a story that never felt true. For Jack Carman, the announcement also mattered. He had been pulled into the case as the supposed answer, had spent time imprisoned, and had lived with the consequences of that old accusation. When investigators later acknowledged that Henry Newell was responsible, Jack's place in the story changed in public as well as in law. The file no longer held him at the center. It placed him where he belonged, as another person harmed by the case's early misdirection. You can sit with that for a moment. A cold case can have more than one wounded life around it. Christie was the child whose life was taken. Her family carried the deepest loss. Jack Carman carried a false burden. Even the community carried an old misunderstanding. When patient detective work finally corrects a case, it does not make any of those burdens vanish, but it stops adding weight to the wrong place. The Christie Mullins case is therefore not only about the man eventually named, it is about the discipline of returning to the record without pride. It is about how an investigation must be willing to become teachable again, even after decades. That is not always easy for institutions, because old reports can feel like settled ground. But sometimes the settled ground is only compacted error. As you turn another page, the sensory world of the file becomes almost familiar. The paper sighs a little. A staple catches at the corner of a report. The photograph sleeve feels smooth under your fingertips. Outside the imagined archive, the city keeps moving. But inside this work, time narrows to the next sentence, the next statement, the next name. That is how cold cases are often solved, not in a rush, but in the patience of reading. And when we return to the witnesses, the Christie Mullins case begins to show how memory can both fail and endure. Witnesses are human. That sounds simple, but it is one of the most important truths in any old investigation. A person can remember a face and forget a time. A person can be certain about a sound and mistaken about direction. A person can say what they believe is helpful, and another can say what protects them. The detective's task is to listen with compassion, but also with structure. In 1975, witnesses around Graceland gave police pieces of a confused afternoon. The shopping center was public, ordinary, and moving. People came and went. Cars passed through, children walked, adults ran errands. The sounds would have overlapped: engines, voices, footsteps, doors closing, the distant rasp of traffic on North High Street. A person who saw one part of that afternoon might not understand what it meant until later, if ever. Henry Newell's role as a witness gained importance because he offered a narrative when investigators needed one. You and I know from the long view that a narrative can be comforting before it is accurate. It gathers scattered facts into a line. It gives police something to follow. But when the wrong person is giving that line, the investigation may travel very far before anyone realizes the road was made for them. That is why the cold case review had to be slow. Detectives could not simply replace one assumption with another. They had to look at what supported Newell's responsibility, what contradicted his earlier position as a witness, and what the later family account added. The file had already suffered from a premature answer. A second answer had to be more careful than the first. You can imagine a detective reading Newell's original statement several times, each reading with a different question. First, what did he claim to see? Then, what did he avoid saying? Then, how did his account influence the sketch? Then, how did that sketch influence the search for Jack Carman? Each reading loosens another thread, and the file, after so many years, begins to give up the shape it had been holding. There is also the matter of proximity. Newell was not a distant informant who heard a rumor after the fact. He was near enough to become part of the original scene, near enough to speak with authority, near enough for his version to matter. Proximity can make someone useful to investigators. It can also make someone dangerous to the truth, if the person is hiding behind the usefulness. As we sit with this part of the Christie Mullins case, we notice how ordinary the dangerous mistakes can look at first. A detective writes down a witness account. A sketch artist creates an image. Officers search for someone who resembles it. A man is found. A confession is taken. Each step has an official shape. Each step can fit into a report. Yet the line between procedure and truth is not automatic. That is one reason cold case units are so important. They bring distance. They bring fresh eyes. They are not untouched by human error, of course, but they can see around the old urgency. The phone is not ringing with the same pressure it had on the first day. The reporters are not waiting outside in the same way. The city is not holding its breath. The work can become quieter, and sometimes truth needs quiet. You, as the detective tonight, can feel the value of that quiet. You are not chasing someone through streets. You are not trying to solve everything before sunset. You are sitting beneath a small lamp with the archive air a little cool on your hands, letting the old pages tell you where they were once spent. A patient case file has its own pace, and we follow it because rushing would only repeat the oldest mistake. The family memory brought by Pam Brown gave the case another layer. Her statement suggested that Henry Newell had carried knowledge of Christie's death in a way that was not public. Investigators had to ask whether what she said matched details in the old record, and whether her account made sense beside Newell's original role. In a case this old, corroboration is not always a single neat match. Sometimes it is a pattern of alignment. Patterns matter in cold cases. One old inconsistency may be nothing. Two may be meaningful. Three, placed beside a later confession and the wrongful path toward another man, begin to form a different landscape. You can imagine placing small paper flags on the file, each one marking a point where Newell's story no longer sits comfortably. The flags may be quiet, but together they change the room. The Christie Mullins case was closed by police with Henry Newell named as the person responsible, but that closure had a different texture from a conviction. It was more like a careful public correction. The department acknowledged that the evidence, witness history, and later statements pointed to Newell. They also acknowledged, in effect, that Jack Carman should not have been made to carry the case. That combination is part of why the ending feels sober rather than triumphant. There is no need for triumph here. Christie was still gone. Her family still had years they could not recover. Jack Carmen's life had still been altered by an accusation built on fragile ground. The best tone for this kind of ending is the one we have been keeping all along: quiet, careful, and respectful of what cannot be repaired. Some solved cases do not ask for applause. They ask for listening, but there was another human thread in the Christie Mullins case, and it belongs to the people who kept reading when the world had already moved on. It is easy to imagine a cold case as a locked cabinet, but in truth, it is often kept alive by small human refusals: a father who says the answer is wrong, a niece who eventually speaks, a writer who notices contradictions, a detective who is willing to spend hours with brittle pages. None of these acts alone solves everything. Together, over enough years, they can bring an old case back into the light. Robert Mullins's doubt deserves a place in that quiet sequence. A parent's doubt is not evidence by itself, but it can be the reason evidence is looked at again. You can picture him holding the official answer and feeling deep down that it did not settle. That kind of feeling may have no legal form, but it can become persistent. It can keep a case from sinking completely into the back of a drawer. There is something deeply human in that persistence. Families often learn details they never wanted to know. They remember dates no one else marks. They keep clippings, letters, photographs, and court documents in envelopes that soften at the seams. The paper may sit in a bedroom drawer or a closet box, carrying the smell of old newsprint and home dust. Every so often, someone opens it again because love has not become tired enough to stop. In Christie's case, persistence also came from people willing to question authority without turning the story into spectacle. John Oler examined the case with attention to the legal and investigative failures that had shaped it. Advocates and reporters helped keep the questions visible. Cold case detectives then had to do the official work of review. You and I can see how many hands touched the final answer, even if only a few names are remembered publicly. This kind of investigation is not solitary in the way fiction sometimes suggests. It is a relay across years. One person preserves a doubt. Another finds a document. Another hears a family confession. Another compares old statements. Another signs the final report. The work passes from hand to hand, and the file gathers the warmth and wear of all that handling. The sensory details of a long investigation are modest. A copier warms up. A paperclip leaves a rust stain. Someone writes a date in the margin. Rain taps against the office window while a detective reads the same paragraph again. These are not the details that usually make people lean forward. They are the details that let a listener settle back, because they are the real sounds of patient work. As you sit with the Christie Mullins case, you may begin to feel that the solution was less a door opening than a room becoming better lit. Henry Newell's name had always been inside the room. Jack Carmen's false confession had stood in front of it. The later review did not invent a new fact so much as rearrange the furniture of the case until the old fact could be seen. That is a gentle way to understand solved cold cases. They are not always solved because the past changes. They are solved because someone learns to look at the past without the old obstruction. The page is the same page. The ink is the same ink, but the reader has changed, and sometimes the reader's humility is the missing tool. In 2015, when police announced their conclusion, the Christie Mullins case entered public memory in a new way. It became a story about a wrongly accused man as well as a murdered girl. It became a story about a witness who was later identified as the true perpetrator. It became a story about a family's long refusal to accept a shallow ending. All of those truths can sit together without competing. You and I do not have to force them into a single lesson. We can let them rest side by side, like photographs on a table. Christie's school-age face. Jack Carmen's vulnerable place in the record. Henry Newell's early witness statement. Pam Brown's later account. The cold case detective's review. The table is full, and the room is quiet, and we are only trying to see each thing clearly. When a case has lived for 38 years before its truth begins to settle, every small correction feels larger than it looks. A name moved from suspect to victim of error. A witness moved from helpful observer to responsible party. A family moved from uncertainty toward acknowledgement. A department moved from old certainty toward public correction. These are not loud movements. but they are real. The Christie Mullins case also reminds us that solving a case can mean more than identifying the person responsible. It can mean repairing the story enough that future readers are not misled by the same old path. It can mean placing caution in the margin for every investigator who comes after. It can mean saying, quietly and officially, that the first answer was not the final truth. This is why we stay with the process. The process is not background, it is the heart of the case. The hours of reading, the comparison of statements, the willingness to hear a niece's memory, and the decision to re-examine a long-dead witness all formed the path. Without that patience, Christie's file might still be sitting under the weight of the wrong conclusion. And so, as we turn another page, we come back to the first days again, because the solution after 38 years makes those early choices feel newly important. The first days of an investigation are like wet cement. Impressions made there can harden quickly. In the Christie Mullins case, the early impression was shaped by fear, urgency, and Henry Newell's account. Police needed a suspect, and the sketch offered a visible target. Jack Carman became linked to that target. The case moved with a speed that later patients could not fully undo. You can imagine how the sketch must have traveled. It may have appeared in newspapers, passed through police hands, described in conversations, and held in the minds of people trying to help. A composite image has a strange power. It feels specific even when it is only approximate. It can invite memory, but it can also create memory, giving people a face to attach to their uncertainty. When Jack Carman resembled that image, the resemblance mattered more than it should have. Resemblance is not proof. It is a beginning, and a weak one unless supported by other solid facts. Yet in the atmosphere of an urgent case, a resemblance can feel like a sign. You and I, with the calm distance of years, can see how dangerous that feeling can be. The interrogation then became the next turning point. Jack's vulnerabilities were central, because a person who wants to please authority, or who cannot fully understand consequences, may say what others seem to need. That is not a mystery in the dramatic sense. It is a known human risk. Modern investigators are more aware of it now, though awareness never removes the need for care. The confession in Christie's case did not survive careful scrutiny. Jack Carman was eventually acquitted, but the fact that he had been convicted at all shows how powerful a confession can be. Courts, police, newspapers, and communities often treat confessions as if they are the strongest evidence. Sometimes they are. Sometimes they are the place where an investigation has most clearly failed. You can feel the sadness of that as the file rests open. The page does not shout, it simply records. A vulnerable man confessed, was convicted, then acquitted. The ink is calm, but the human cost beneath it is not small. Sleepy as our voices are tonight, we do not make that cost disappear. We only hold it with care and keep moving gently. The later review of the Christie Mullins case had to account for that confession not as truth, but as evidence of misdirection. That is an important shift. Once the confession is understood as unreliable, it no longer points toward Jack. Instead, it points back toward the conditions that produced it, including the pressure of the investigation and the strength of the witness account that had already aimed suspicion elsewhere. In that way, the false confession became part of the path to the later solution, not because it helped identify Henry Newell directly, but because its failure forced people to reconsider the foundation beneath it. When the center of a case collapses, the careful investigator does not simply build another center in the same place. They return to the edges. They ask who framed the first picture. Henry Newell framed much of that first picture. He offered police a description, he supplied a direction, he stood close to the opening of the file. Years later, when his niece's statement came forward and investigators reviewed his role, that framing became one of the most important facts. The witness was no longer outside the mystery. He was woven through it. This is why the Christie Mullins case feels so much like patient detective work rather than sudden discovery. The answer required a change of category. A person listed in one mental folder had to be moved to another. That sounds simple, but in police work, categories can become habits. Witness, suspect, victim, informant. Once a name is placed, it can stay there unless someone has the patience to lift it out. You can imagine the cold case detective doing exactly that. The name Henry Newell appears on an old page. The detective writes it again on a fresh pad. The air in the office smells faintly of paper, toner, and coffee gone lukewarm. Nothing dramatic happens, except that the name is no longer being read the old way. That small private change is where many public answers begin. The family confession brought the private and public worlds together. Pam Brown's account suggested that the truth had existed outside the official file for years, held in memory rather than evidence packaging. That happens more often than we like to think. The official record may be incomplete, while unofficial knowledge moves quietly through relatives, neighbors, and old conversations that no one knows how to report. It takes courage to speak after years have passed. A person may fear being disbelieved. They may fear hurting family members. They may fear being asked why they waited. You and I can hold those complications gently, because cold cases are rarely simple for the living. The dead cannot be interviewed. The living carry the aftermath, and sometimes the truth must make its way through their hesitation. Investigators then had to listen without making the opposite mistake. They could not believe Pam Brown simply because her account fit a long suspicion. They had to compare, check, and weigh. The file demanded patience again, and in that repeated patience, the Christie Mullins case moved closer to the answer Columbus police finally announced. There is a soft dignity in that kind of work. It does not erase the original failure, but it refuses to let failure have the last word. The cold case review becomes a second reading, and a second reading can be kinder to the truth. It can notice the overlooked witness. It can hear the false confession differently. It can take a family's long doubt seriously. When the case was closed with Henry Newell named, it did not mean every question had become simple. Old cases rarely offer that. There may still be unknown moments, unspoken details, and exact sequences that can no longer be recovered. Time takes things, weather takes things, memory takes things. But enough remained for investigators to say that the central answer had changed, and that matters. You can picture the announcement not as a triumphant press conference, but as a sober correction. Papers on a podium, reporters listening, a police official naming Henry Newell, the name Christie Mullins spoken again in public, not as an old headline, but as a person whose case deserved a clearer ending. Somewhere in that room the air would have felt practical and heavy, the way official rooms feel when long history is compressed into prepared remarks. For listeners half asleep tonight, it may be enough to understand the shape. A girl died in 1975. A vulnerable man was wrongly accused and convicted, then acquitted. The early witness remained in the file for decades. His niece later reported that he had confessed. Cold case detectives reviewed the old record and named him as responsible. The path is simple when spoken that way, but the lived years inside it were not simple at all. That is why we do not rush. We give each portion room. Christie's life, her family's doubt, Jack Carman's wrongful burden, Henry Newell's shifting place in the record, Pam Brown's late statement, the detective's review. Each part belongs in the soft circle of lamplight, and none of it needs sharp music or raised voices. The case has already had enough noise. As the file settles again, we can move toward the city itself, because places remember differently than people do. Columbus in 1975 was not the same Columbus that heard the police announcement in 2015. The buildings, roads, and neighborhoods had changed, and so had the expectations of police work. In the earlier world, many people trusted confessions more readily, questioned interrogation methods less often, and had fewer tools for re-examining old evidence. In the later world, wrongful convictions had become more visible, and cold case review had become its own kind of discipline. Graceland Shopping Center had its own ordinary life through all those changes. People parked there, shopped there, hurried through rain, carried children, lost receipts, and forgot where they had left their cars. You can imagine the sound of cartwheels on pavement, the smell of fast food drifting from nearby storefronts, and the flat afternoon brightness on windshields. Most of that life had nothing to do with the file, and yet the file remained tied to that place. A case location can become both specific and ghostly over time. Investigators know the coordinates. Families know the emotional map. Shoppers may know nothing at all. When you walk through a place like that years later, if you know the story, The air can seem layered. One layer is ordinary present life. Another is the old afternoon. Another is the investigation, the questions, and the long return. The Christie Mullins case belongs to that layered kind of place. It is not only a name in a police archive, it is also a path behind a shopping center, a summer date, a family's memory, and a community's old fear. When the case was solved after so many years, it did not remove those layers. It gave them a clearer order. You and I can imagine the cold case detective visiting the area, even if only in thought, while reviewing the old reports. The modern road sounds would be different. The trees might not be the same. The exact view from 1975 may be impossible to restore, but the detective can still stand there in the mind and ask the old questions again. Who was near? Who spoke? Who directed attention? Who benefited from the first story? That mental walk is part of patient investigation. It is not enough to read a statement. You have to imagine the space in which the statement was made. If Henry Newell claimed to see something, where was he? What could he see? How quickly could he move? What would others have noticed? These are ordinary spatial questions, but in an old case they can become the quiet hinges of truth. The file does not give us every answer in perfect detail, and that is all right. We are not here to force certainty where the record has grown thin. We are here to follow the method, the return, the reconsideration. In that method, the Christie Mullins case becomes almost a lesson in reading. You read the statement, you read the silence around it. You read the choices that followed. The choices that followed Henry Newell's statement were profound. A sketch was created. Jack Carman was identified. A confession was obtained. A prosecution moved forward. Years of correction followed. If you trace that sequence with your finger along the page, the line feels almost too direct. One early account can redirect an entire case, and that is why early accounts must be treated with care. Cold case detectives understand this in a way younger investigators may only learn with time. The first hours matter, but so does the humility to revisit them. A case file is not a monument. It is a record of human work, and human work can be both devoted and flawed. When we sit with Christie's case, we are really sitting with that dual truth. People tried to solve it, people also got it wrong. There is no contradiction in saying both. In fact, saying both is one way to honor the work properly. If we pretend investigators never cared, we flatten the past. If we pretend they never failed, we flatten it another way. The truth is more difficult and more useful. Under pressure, with limited tools and a vulnerable suspect in front of them, the original investigation accepted the wrong answer. The later investigation did something different. It widened the lens. It allowed Henry Newell's status to change. It took seriously a family member's report. It considered the unreliability of Jack Carman's confession. It placed old facts beside new statements and asked what held. That is not glamorous. It is better than glamorous, it is careful. When you are trying to fall asleep, carefulness has a rhythm of its own. The page turns, the chair creaks softly, a car passes outside, the old file waits without impatience. There is no need to solve everything in one breath. The Christie Mullins case took decades to reach its corrected answer, and tonight we can let that long pace guide our own. Another part of the case belongs to apology, though apology is never simple after so many years. When official error has shaped lives, acknowledgement must arrive with humility. It cannot give back the lost time, but it can stop the record from continuing to injure. Jack Carman's name needed to be cleared, not only legally but narratively. People needed to understand that the old confession was not the truth of Christie's case. That kind of correction matters in public memory. A newspaper archive can preserve suspicion long after a courtroom changes direction. A neighbor's memory can hold an old accusation longer than the law does. A family can hear whispers for years. When police publicly named Henry Newell, they also helped shift the remembered story away from Jack. It was late, but lateness does not make correction meaningless. You can imagine Jack's own experience only gently, and only from the outside. The record tells us enough to know he was vulnerable and wrongly pulled into the case. It does not require us to inhabit his fear in detail. We can simply acknowledge that a person's life can be altered by a confession that should never have been trusted, and that patient review can sometimes give part of that life back in the eyes of others. Christie's family, meanwhile, had to live with a different kind of waiting. Their waiting was not abstract. It had birthdays in it, empty places at family tables, anniversaries, and the steady ache of seeing other children grow past the age Christie reached. When a case takes 38 years to solve, the waiting becomes woven into a family's ordinary routines. It is there in holidays, old photographs, and the names people speak more softly. There is a photograph quality to every old victim's story, a school picture, a family snapshot, a face printed in a newspaper. Over time, the photograph becomes both memory and evidence. The paper may curl a little at the edges. The colors may fade, but the person in the image remains fixed at the age they were, while everyone around them grows older. That is one of the quiet sorrows inside Christie Mullins's file. When investigators finally named Henry Newell, they were not restoring Christie's future. No investigation can do that. They were restoring truth to the record and giving her family a more honest answer. In cold case work, that is often the gift available. It is a modest word, answer, but after decades, it can feel like a door in a room that had no doors. The Christie Mullins case also asks us to consider how truth can survive in fragments. One fragment in an original report, one in a family memory, one in the failure of a confession, one in a father's doubt, one in a later detective's review. None of them alone may have been enough at the beginning, but together, after time had worn down the old certainty, they became a path. You and I can follow that path without hurrying. It moves from the warm afternoon behind Graceland to the police room where Jack Carman was questioned. It moves through court proceedings, acquittal, long silence, family disclosures, and cold case review. It moves across 38 years like a thread through worn cloth. The thread is not bright, but it holds. But there is still another layer to sit with, and it is the way this case teaches patience to anyone who reads old files. A cold case file is not only a container of facts, it is a record of attention. Some details were noticed, some were missed, some were noticed but misread. Some were set aside because they did not fit the early theory. When you become the quiet detective tonight, reading beside the lamp, you begin to understand that attention has ethics. What we notice and what we fail to notice can shape lives. In the Christie Mullins case, the attention first moved toward Jack Carman. His resemblance to the composite sketch and the confession that followed became powerful enough to carry the case into conviction. But the attention had been directed there by Henry Newell's account, and that is where the later review had to return. To solve the case, investigators had to ask not only what had been seen, but who had guided the seeing. That question can be asked softly. Who guided the seeing? It is a gentle phrase, but a serious one. In any investigation, someone's account may establish the first frame. Once that frame is in place, later facts may be forced to fit inside it. Cold case work often begins by lifting the frame away and looking at the picture again, even if the picture has faded. You can picture that fading in the materials themselves. Old photographs with pale borders, police reports typed on paper that has gone cream-colored with age, evidence tags written by hands that may no longer be living, the soft, powdery smell of storage rooms, the faint tack of adhesive on old labels. These are the physical textures of patience, and they remind us that truth sometimes waits in imperfect containers. The modern detective reviewing Christie's case had to work with those containers. There may have been missing pieces. There may have been evidence too degraded to speak as clearly as people wished. There may have been witnesses whose memories were no longer available, but the old files still held enough structure for a careful reader. It held names, sequences, contradictions, and the strange persistence of Henry Newell at the opening of the case. The niece's account, arriving after so long, did not replace that structure. It illuminated it. That is an important distinction. A late confession report can be powerful, but its strength grows when it fits with existing doubts. Pam Brown's statement fit with the re-examination of Newell's original role, and with the long-recognized problems in Jack Carman's confession. Together, those parts gave investigators a clearer foundation. In a courtroom, the absence of Henry Newell would have mattered deeply. A living defendant has rights, and a case must be proved under strict standards. But a cold case closure after a suspect's death is a different official act. It is not a trial. It is a conclusion by investigators based on the evidence available. You and I can keep that distinction in mind as we move quietly through the file. Keeping distinctions clear is part of compassionate narration. We do not need to overstate what happened. Police named Newell as responsible. They did so after reviewing the evidence and later accounts. The announcement corrected the old direction of the case. That is enough. We can avoid the hard edges of certainty beyond the record, while still respecting the conclusion investigators reached. Christie's name remains at the center. It can be tempting in a case with a wrongful accusation to let the procedural failure take over the story. But the reason the procedure mattered is because a child's case deserved truth. The reason Jack's false confession mattered is because it kept that truth away. The reason Newell's name mattered is because it answered, as much as it could, what had happened to Christie. You turn another page, and the room seems to settle. The old paper has become familiar now. The story has widened, but its motion remains slow. We are not moving toward a sharp ending tonight. We are moving through the layers, letting the file teach us how the answer came after decades of being almost visible. There is a kind of reverence in rereading, not worship of the file because files are made by people and people make mistakes, but reverence for the lives inside it, and for the possibility that attention can still do good after a long delay. The Christie Mullins case asks for that kind of reverence. It asks us to sit with Christie, with her family, with Jack Carman, and with the investigators who finally returned to Henry Newell's name. In the quiet of this retelling, the city outside our imagined window has become night. The archive room is cooler. The lamp has a small circle of light. Somewhere in the distance, a building system hums, and the sound is steady enough to fade into the background. You and I are still here, not because the case is dramatic, but because it is human, and because human things deserve patient attention. The next part of the file is less about discovery and more about recognition, and recognition has its own slow music. Recognition, in a cold case like Christie Mullins, often begins as a small discomfort. You read a familiar sentence, then read it again, and the second reading feels different from the first. The words have not changed, but your trust in them has. You notice the witness, who seemed helpful. You notice the vulnerable suspect who seemed too easily fitted into the story. You notice the old sketch, not as a neutral image, but as a doorway through which the wrong answer entered. That is the quiet work we are sitting with now. You and I are not looking for a hidden compartment or a single brilliant clue. We are watching the file become legible in a new way. The Christie Mullins case asks us to understand that recognition can be patient, almost humble, like realizing after many years that a photograph on the wall had been hung slightly crooked, and that everyone had learned to tilt their eyes instead of straightening it. The police who revisited the case had the advantage of distance. Distance can be painful for families because it means time has passed without an answer. But for investigators, it can sometimes loosen the grip of old assumptions. The first detectives had worked in the heat of the immediate loss. The later detectives worked in the cooler air of review. They could look at the old reports without the same urgency pressing on their shoulders. You can imagine the first file box being opened in a modern office. The lid resists a little, then lifts. Inside are folders, envelopes, typed reports, copied statements, perhaps photographs protected in sleeves. The scent is not dramatic, just paper, cardboard, and the faint dryness of time. A detective reaches in carefully, because the material is old, and because the lives inside it deserve careful hands. The Christie Mullins case, by then, had become more than a homicide file. It had become a record of an investigative path that needed examination. That makes the work more complex. A detective reviewing it has to ask two questions at once. What happened to Christie? And how did the first investigation move away from the answer? One question looks toward the crime, the other looks toward the process. Process can sound like a cold word, but here it is, deeply human. Process is how a witness is heard. Process is how a vulnerable person is protected or not protected. Process is how doubt is preserved when pressure wants certainty. You and I, sitting beside the small lamp, can feel that the process in this case mattered as much as any single piece of evidence, because it shaped the lives that followed. When Henry Newell gave his account in 1975, the process received him as someone helping. That role gave his words power. He helped form the picture of someone else. That picture helped draw attention to Jack Carman. The movement from witness statement to sketch to suspect to confession may have seemed orderly at the time, but order is not the same as truth. There is a soft lesson in that difference. A report can be neat and still be wrong. A timeline can be typed cleanly and still be built on a false premise. A confession can appear to close a case and still leave the real answer untouched. The Christie Mullins case holds all of those possibilities, and it asks us to keep our voices low enough to hear them. As the cold case review unfolded, investigators had to treat Newell's early presence as a fact in need of explanation. Why was he there? What did he say? How did his statement affect the direction of the case? Did the later account from his niece fit with the older record? These questions are not flashy, but they are the questions that bring old cases back into focus. You can picture a detective writing Henry Newell's name at the top of a clean sheet. Beneath it, perhaps, a list begins to form. Original witness, present near Graceland, gave description, helped create sketch, later reported confession. The handwriting may be ordinary. The pen may leave a small shine of ink before it dries. Yet with each line, the old category shifts a little more. That shift matters because old cases often hide inside their own language. If a person is called a witness for long enough, people may stop testing the word. If a confession is called solved for long enough, people may stop asking whether it was reliable. If a case is called cold for long enough, people may stop believing it can speak. Patient investigation begins by loosening those words. In Christie's case, the word witness had to be loosened from Henry Newell. The word confession had to be loosened from Jack Carman. The word solved had to be set aside until the evidence could support it honestly. You and I can feel how much of the work is almost linguistic, as if the detectives were not only moving through evidence, but through the names that evidence had been given. The family's role in this recognition was not mechanical, it was emotional and persistent. Christie's family had lived with the old labels longer than any detective. They knew what it felt like when an official answer failed to bring rest. That kind of knowledge is not a forensic tool, but it can keep pressure on the truth in a quiet way, through letters, questions, conversations, and refusals to let a file disappear. You can imagine a family kitchen years after the case began. There might be a folder on the table, old clippings spread beside a cup of coffee, the paper soft from being handled. Someone rereads a familiar article. Someone remembers what was said in court. Someone wonders again why the witness's story seemed accepted so quickly. The room is not an evidence lab, but it is another place where the case survives. Cold cases survive in those domestic spaces more often than official histories admit. They survive in drawers, shoeboxes, photo albums, and the memory of a parent who can still recite a date decades later. Christie Mullins' name stayed alive that way. It stayed alive in family grief, public doubt, legal history, and eventually in the formal attention of cold case detectives. The niece's disclosure, when it came, moved through that same human landscape. Pam Brown did not bring a laboratory report. She brought a memory of what Henry Newell had said. That sort of memory must be handled with caution, but caution does not mean dismissal. It means the detective leans closer, listens more carefully, and then asks the old file whether the memory has a place to stand. In the Christie Mullins case, it did. The memory stood beside Henry Newell's early role. It stood beside the problems in Jack Carman's confession. It stood beside the long-standing doubt about the first resolution. It stood beside the basic fact that Newell had been close enough to shape the investigation from within. No single piece had to carry the whole weight. The weight was shared. That is another calm principle of cold case work. A case becomes stronger when pieces support one another. A late statement is stronger when it matches old concerns. An old concern is stronger when a new statement explains it. A wrongful confession becomes more meaningful when another person's early influence can be traced. The pieces do not shout. They lean together. You can hear the quiet sound of that leaning if you imagine paper being arranged on a long table. Reports from 1975 in one stack, court records in another, later interviews in another. Notes from the cold case review spread in the middle. A detective moves one page closer to another, not because the movement proves anything alone, but because proximity on the table helps the mind see connections. The Christie Mullins case, after 38 years, was solved through those connections. It was not solved by disregarding the old record, but by reading it more honestly. The old record contained both truth and error. It contained Christie's name, the location, early statements, and the path that led toward Jack Carman. It also contained the seeds of correction, because Henry Newell's name was there from the beginning. There is a gentle irony in that, but we should not sharpen it. It is not a clever twist. It is a sad feature of many investigations that the person who appears helpful may sometimes be the person who most needs scrutiny. That does not mean witnesses should be treated with suspicion by default. It means investigators must listen with compassion and test with discipline. Compassion and discipline belong together in this case. Compassion for Christie and her family. Compassion for Jack Carman, who was vulnerable and wrongly accused. Compassion even for witnesses who may have been confused or afraid. Discipline toward every statement, every confession, every assumption, and every official conclusion. Without compassion, investigation becomes cold. Without discipline, it becomes dangerous. You and I can let that balance guide the rest of the file. The room stays quiet, the lamp stays low, the pages keep their patient order. We do not need to raise the temperature of the story to feel its importance. In fact, lowering the temperature helps us see it better, because the Christie Mullins case was harmed once by urgency and repaired as much as it could be by calm review. In the years before the police announcement, the culture around wrongful convictions had begun to change. People had learned more about false confessions, especially among juveniles, people with intellectual disabilities, and those who felt intimidated or eager to please authority. That broader understanding helped create a climate in which Jack Carman's old confession could be seen more clearly. The case did not exist outside its time. It moved through changing knowledge. This is often true of long investigations. The evidence remains old, but the questions become modern. A detective in 2015 knows things about interrogation risk that were less widely recognized in 1975. A modern reviewer may also know more about confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and the dangers of building a case around a statement that seems too useful. These concepts are technical, but their consequences are personal. You can picture a training manual on a shelf, a modern policy folder, a detective's notes on interview reliability, and then the old Christie file resting beside them. The contrast is quiet but important. The modern materials do not solve the case by themselves. They give the detective a sharper way to understand how the first case went wrong. Confirmation bias is a formal term, but in the file it feels like something simpler. Once police believed Jack Carman might be the man in the sketch, other details may have begun to arrange themselves around that belief. His confession then seemed to confirm the direction. The case moved forward. But if the sketch itself had been shaped by Henry Newell, and if Jack's confession was unreliable, the apparent confirmation was built on sand. That is why the later review had to reach beneath the confession. It had to ask what came before it. What conditions made it possible? Who pointed the investigation there? What was missed because everyone was looking where the sketch told them to look? You and I turn back through the pages, and the movement feels almost like walking upstream, away from the conviction, away from the confession, back toward the first witness. At the source of that stream stands Henry Newell. His name appears with the plainness of official ink. Nothing about the letters themselves tells you what they will later mean. Henry, then Newell. A name can sit quietly for decades, bearing one meaning until the right question makes it bear another. The file does not change its spelling. It changes its gravity. The later confession reported by Pam Brown gave that gravity a center. It suggested that Newell had known more than any helpful witness should know. Investigators then looked back, and the old actions around the sketch and the misdirection toward Jack Carman appeared differently. This is recognition again, not invention. Recognition. The case was not being rewritten from nothing. It was being reread from the beginning. There is comfort, in a strange way, in knowing that rereading can matter. It means that old work is not always final. It means that errors, though painful, do not always remain untouched. It means that a file in storage may still have a future if someone is willing to carry it back into the light. The Christie Mullins case waited a long time for that kind of reading. The waiting itself deserves space. 38 years is not just a number, even when we write it in words for the voice to pass over gently. It is seasons, elections, school years, hospital visits, funerals, moves, new buildings, closed stores, and children becoming grandparents. It is enough time for a city to change its face. It is enough time for evidence boxes to yellow and for memories to soften at the edges. During those years, Christie remained 14 in the file. That is one of the tender facts of old cases. The victim does not age with the investigators. Christie's photographs stayed anchored in youth, while detectives retired, family members grew older, and Henry Newell himself moved toward the end of his life. The file kept her at the threshold of high school years she never reached. You can sit with that without making it sharp. We only acknowledge it. A young person's case can become old while the young person remains young in every image and every report. That contrast is part of why cold case work carries such emotional weight. It asks adults decades later to return to the unfinished protection of a child. When police finally named Henry Newell, the announcement reached backward across all those years. It could not change the summer day in 1975. It could not restore the lost time. But it could correct the path of memory. The official story no longer had to bend around Jack Carman's false confession. It could point toward the man whose name had been waiting, troublingly near the start. The correction was also an act of care for the future. Anyone reading the Christie Mullins case after that point would encounter a different structure. They would see Jack Carman not as the lingering suspect of an old rumor, but as a person wrongly accused. They would see Henry Newell not merely as a witness, but as the person investigators ultimately identified. The record had been rearranged toward truth. You and I know that truth in an old case may still have gaps. There are things only the person responsible could have fully explained. There are exact moments that no report can recover. There are questions that remain small and stubborn. But a solved cold case does not require every grain of dust to be named. It requires enough honest evidence to answer the central question as responsibly as possible. In Christie's case, the central answer became Henry Newell. The way there passed through family memory, investigative humility, and the re-examination of a wrongful confession. That path is worth lingering over because it shows what justice can look like when it comes late. It is quieter than people expect. It may arrive in a report, a press room, a family conversation, or a corrected paragraph in public memory. The room around us stays still as we think about that. The lamp's circle of light has perhaps shifted slightly as the night deepens. The papers cast soft shadows over one another. Somewhere beyond the window, a car moves through wet pavement, and the sound fades. You can let the case settle at this slower pace, because the work itself took its time, and our retelling should not pretend otherwise. When we look again at Jack Carman's part of the file, we are reminded that clearing the wrong person is not separate from solving the case. It is part of solving it. A case with the wrong person at its center remains unsolved in a moral sense, even if official forms say otherwise. Until the wrong name is removed, the right name cannot fully be seen. Jack's acquittal in the late 1970s removed the conviction, but the public narrative took longer to correct. That difference matters. Courts can change status quickly compared with memory. Memory is slower. It lingers in news archives, neighborhood talk, and simplified retellings. The 2015 announcement helped reshape that memory, giving people a clearer way to understand the old miscarriage. You can imagine someone who had heard the case only vaguely, years before, reading the updated account. The old assumption falls away. The story becomes more complicated, but also more truthful. Christie was not helped by the false certainty placed on Jack Carman. Jack was harmed by it. Henry Newell's early statement now appears as part of the reason the case went wrong. The pieces become harder and more honest. Honesty in cold cases often means accepting discomfort. It is uncomfortable to say that police were misled. It is uncomfortable to say that police accepted a vulnerable man's confession too readily. It is uncomfortable to say that the person later identified was treated first as a witness. But discomfort is not the enemy of truth. It is often the doorway into it. The Christie Mullins case passed through that doorway slowly. The detectives who reviewed it had to stand in the same record that earlier detectives had created and look at it without defensiveness. That is not a small act. Institutions are made of people, and people can be protective of their predecessors, their departments, and their own sense of order. Cold case work sometimes asks them to protect truth more than reputation. You and I can respect that choice when it is made. It does not erase the old harm, but it matters. A corrected record is better than an uncorrected one. A public acknowledgement is better than silence. A name placed carefully after evidence review is better than a wrong name allowed to hover forever. In an old case, these may be the forms justice can still take. There is a soft sound in that thought, like a folder closing part way, but not all the way. Some questions remain, some grief remains, some lessons remain open for anyone willing to learn from them. The file is not a bedtime story in the simple sense, but it has the pace of one, because it moves through repetition, return, and gradual understanding. As we sit with Christie Mullins, we also sit with the broader history of cold case units. These units exist because time changes what can be known. A witness may speak later. Technology may improve. Old assumptions may weaken. A detective with no attachment to the first theory may read the same facts differently. The Christie case is one small room in that larger house of patient work. Cold case detectives often begin with inventory. What evidence exists? Where is it stored? What reports remain? Who is still alive? What was tested? What was never tested? What theories were written down and which ones were only passed between people? This inventory can be slow and tedious, but it is also a kind of respect. Before you can seek truth, you must know what you actually have. You can imagine that inventory in Christie's case. The boxes come out, the labels are checked, old names are entered into modern systems, contacts are traced. A statement from 1975 is compared with a statement made decades later. The detective may pause over a faded photocopy, feeling the slight roughness of the page, and realize that the past is not finished speaking. The first time through a file, the detective learns the official story. The second time, they learn the weak points. The third time, they begin to hear the silences. That is the rhythm of review. You and I have been following it tonight, circling the same names gently, not because we are lost, but because patient understanding often comes through return. The official story said Jack Carman confessed. The weak point was that Jack's confession was unreliable and later legally undone. The silence concerned Henry Newell, whose role had never been resolved with the scrutiny it deserved. Pam Brown's account filled part of that silence. The cold case review then gave it official form. There is a calm geometry to it now. Not perfect, but clearer. Christie at the center. Henry Newell near the beginning as witness, and later named as responsible. Jack Carman drawn wrongly into the center, then moved back out. Family persistence surrounding the file. Cold case detectives bringing the pieces into alignment. You can see the shape without needing it to be sharp. The human heart of this geometry is Christie herself. It is easy for names in cold cases to become functions. Victim, witness, suspect, detective. But Christie was a girl in a family, with an ordinary Saturday around her before the case began. She had a name people called across rooms. She had routines, preferences, perhaps favorite songs, small arguments, and unfinished plans. The file can never hold all of that. We mention this gently because every investigation begins after a life has already been more than the investigation can describe. The police reports start too late to capture the whole person. They begin at the moment something has gone wrong. So when we say the Christie Mullins case, we should remember that the case is only the shadow of a life, not the life itself. Her family knew the life. Investigators knew the case. The cold case review could correct the case, but the family carried the life. That distinction is worth keeping. It keeps our voice compassionate. It reminds us not to treat the solution as an intellectual puzzle alone. It was an answer connected to a person, and to the people who kept loving her after the world moved on. As the years passed, those people had to watch the old case become part of public record. Public record is useful, but it can be cold. It reduces anguish to dates and procedural events. The 23rd of August, 1975. A plea. A conviction, an acquittal. A later statement, a police announcement. You and I add breath between those dates, because lived experience needs more space than a timeline gives it. The breath between dates is where grief lives. It is where doubt lives. It is where a father keeps asking, a niece eventually speaks, and a detective keeps reading after office hours. It is where old paper becomes more than old paper. It is where a case changes from a stack of documents into a long human effort toward a better answer. The Christie Mullins case was solved after 38 years, in the sense that the truth began to take its final official shape after Henry Newell's death and the later disclosures about him. It was publicly closed in 2015, after the Cold Case Review brought those pieces together. That slight difference in timing is part of the old file's texture. Time rarely moves in a single clean line. You can hold both dates without strain. Christie died in 1975. Newell died in 2013, 38 years later. Police publicly named him in 2015. The truth moved through those markers slowly, the way a long river passes under several bridges before reaching open water. We do not need to force it into one moment. The case itself teaches us to accept gradualness. Gradualness is one reason this story fits the quiet hours. There is no chase to follow. There is no sudden noise. There is only the slow correction of a record, the patient reweighing of old words, and the soft return of attention to a girl whose case deserved better. If your eyes are heavy now, the file can still remain open beside us. The work does not demand speed. We turn again to Henry Newell, because the old witness role remains the hinge. A hinge is small compared with a door, but the door moves because of it. Newell's original account moved the investigation. His later reported confession moved the review. Between those 2 points, the case swung from the wrong man toward the right one. You can almost see the motion in the papers. There is a quiet unease in realizing that Newell's help may have been part of the misdirection. It asks us to be careful with people who step forward too confidently, while still honoring the many witnesses who truly help investigations. The lesson is not suspicion for its own sake. The lesson is verification. Trust the person enough to listen. Respect the case enough to check. Verification can be slow. It can mean comparing times, locations, prior statements, family accounts, and physical possibilities. It can mean asking whether a person could have seen what they claimed. It can mean returning to a place decades later and finding that the landscape has changed, so the reconstruction must be partly mental. It can mean accepting that some questions will remain partial. In Christie's case, verification led police to a final conclusion despite the passage of time. That conclusion carried the authority of review, but also the humility of lateness. It did not pretend the system had worked perfectly. It admitted, through the very act of naming Newell, that the original answer had failed. There is something important in that admission, even when it arrives too late to give everyone what they deserved. You and I might pause over the word late. Late is not the same as useless. A late truth can still relieve a false accusation. A late truth can still teach investigators. A late truth can still restore the shape of a story that had been bent for decades. In cold case work, late may be all that remains, and all that remains can still matter. The atmosphere of this case is not darkness but lamplight. That distinction matters. We are not sitting in fear. We are sitting in attention. The file is sad, yes, but it is also a record of people trying again. It holds error and it holds correction. It holds loss and it holds persistence. It holds the sound of old paper, the patience of rereading, and the quiet relief of a name finally placed correctly. When the Columbus police made their announcement, the public learned what the Cold Case Review had concluded. But for the people closest to the case, the emotional meaning was likely more private than public. A press statement can say a case is closed. A family still has to live with what closure means and does not mean. You and I should not assume closure feels simple. Closure is a word often used from the outside. From inside a family, it may feel more like a change in the burden. The burden is not gone. it is carried differently. The uncertainty may lessen, the anger may find a clearer target, the unanswered questions may shrink, though they may not disappear. The old folder may still hurt to open, but it no longer contains the same wrong shape. For Jack Carman, too, the correction would have had layers. Public acknowledgement can matter deeply, but it cannot return the years under suspicion. It cannot erase the experience of being questioned, convicted. It can only speak truth where the record once spoke falsely. That is not everything, but it is not nothing. The Christie Mullins case therefore gives us a form of justice with edges still visible. It is not smooth. It is not complete in the way a fair trial and timely conviction might have been. It is late, partial, and corrective, but it is real. The file moved closer to truth, and the wrong man was publicly moved away from the center of blame. As we continue through the old pages, we can let the detective's patience become the rhythm of the night. Read, compare, listen, doubt, verify, return. Read, compare, listen, doubt, verify, return. Not as a dramatic chant, but as the quiet movement of a mind refusing to accept the easiest answer. This is the rhythm that brought Christie's case to its final official conclusion. The room is still. The paper is still. The case, for so many years unsettled, rests differently now, though not without sorrow. We have not reached the end of our sitting with it. There are still corners of the investigation to touch gently, especially the way old cases shape the people who work them, and the way truth, even when delayed, changes the air around a name. You can feel that change around Christie Mullins's name. At the beginning of the file, her name opens a case that quickly turns toward the wrong suspect. Later, her name opens a story of correction. The name stays the same, but the surrounding words become more honest. That is part of what solving a cold case means. It changes the words that gather round a person. Words matter in official memory. Suspect, acquitted, witness, responsible, closed, unsolved. Each word places a person somewhere in relation to the truth. In the Christie Mullins case, those words shifted across decades, and the shifts were not abstract. They affected reputations, grief, and the way a community understood its own past. When you read the final police conclusion after so many years, you are not only reading a finding, you are reading the result of many changed words. Henry Newell is no longer sheltered by the word witness. Jack Carman is no longer trapped by the word confession. Christie's case is no longer left under the wrong answer. The language has been revised, and the revision is a form of care. There is nothing flashy about revision. Anyone who has worked with old documents knows its quietness. A line is crossed out, a note is added, a file is updated, a public statement is issued. But when the subject is a human life, revision can be profound. It can reopen pain, but it can also let truth breathe where it had been pressed flat. The Christie Mullins case breathed differently after the review. It had room for complexity. It could hold the original failure and the later correction together. It could honor Christie without pretending the investigation had been straightforward. It could acknowledge Jack Carman without making him a footnote. It could name Henry Newell without turning the story into spectacle. That balance is the one we keep tonight. No spectacle, no rush, no hard edges. Only the slow page-turning of a case that took 38 years to solve and 40 years to publicly close in its corrected form. The distinction is gentle, but it is part of the truth, and truth deserves careful timing. You and I remain with the file, and the next pages carry us from recognition toward responsibility, where the old case becomes not only a solved mystery, but a lesson in how patient detective work must care for the living as well as the dead. Responsibility, in the Christie Mullins case, sits in several places at once. It sits with the person investigators eventually named, Henry Newell, whose early witness role became part of the long misdirection. It sits with the first investigation, which accepted Jack Carman's confession too quickly and allowed a vulnerable man to be carried into a conviction. It sits with the later detectives too, because when they reopened the file, they inherited not only the facts, but the duty to handle the old mistakes carefully. You can feel how delicate that inheritance is. A cold case detective does not receive a clean page. They receive a page already marked by other hands, sometimes carefully, sometimes carelessly, sometimes under pressure no later reader can fully imagine. The paper may be thin, the ink may have faded, but the consequences are still alive. Every old note asks to be read with both skepticism and respect. In Christie's file, the responsibility of the later review was not to condemn every earlier action with the comfort of hindsight. That would be too easy and too distant. The responsibility was to understand where the process failed, then correct the record as far as the remaining evidence allowed. You and I can see the difference. Blame may be loud, responsibility is quieter, and often more useful. The first detectives faced a terrible case in real time. They were asked to gather facts while grief was fresh, while witnesses were unsettled, and while the city wanted reassurance. But responsibility still requires us to say that Jack Carman should not have been made to carry the case on such fragile ground. A vulnerable suspect needed more protection than he received. A confession needed more testing than it was given. That truth rests heavily, but we do not need to make it sharp. We place it on the table beside the other facts. Christie deserved a careful investigation. Jack deserved a careful investigation. The community deserved an accurate investigation. When a case fails in those ways, the failure spreads outward, like water slowly moving under a closed door. Years later, the cold case review became a way of pulling up the floorboards and finding where the water had gone. That is patient work. It is not enough to mop the surface. You have to find the path beneath, the place where the old leak began. In the Christie Mullins case, that path ran through Henry Newell's early statement, the sketch it helped shape, and the confession that seemed to finish what the sketch began. You can imagine the detective drawing that path in a notebook, a line from Newell to the composite, a line from the composite to Jack Carman, a line from Jack's confession to the conviction. Then another line, years later, from Jack's acquittal back into uncertainty. Then another line from Pam Brown's account back toward Newell. The page becomes a map, and the map shows how long the case had been circling the same central point. Maps can be calming when they are drawn slowly. They do not solve the pain, but they make the terrain visible. A good cold case map does not pretend that every road is open. Some bridges are gone, some witnesses are lost, some evidence has aged beyond usefulness, but the map can still show where the investigation traveled, where it took a wrong turn, and where it finally returned. The Christie Mullins case returned to Henry Newell by a road made of old statements and later memory. The road was not perfectly paved, few old roads are, but it was clear enough for Columbus police to say that Newell was responsible. That declaration carried responsibility of its own, because naming a dead man cannot be tested in the same way a living defendant can be tested in court. You and I should keep that in mind without letting it weaken the meaning of the review. The police conclusion was not a jury verdict. It was an official investigative finding. It rested on the available evidence, the later reported confession, the failure of the original case against Jack, and Newell's troubling role at the beginning. In an old case, those distinctions are part of the truth, and careful truth is better than simple certainty. Responsibility also means remembering Christie as more than the point around which investigative errors turned. The case is named for her because she was the one lost. Every later correction points back to her. When we sit with the file, we should not let the procedural story eclipse the young person at its center. The paper may be full of adult decisions, but the reason for those decisions was Christie's life. You can picture her name typed at the top of reports, perhaps in all capital letters on a form, perhaps handwritten on an evidence envelope. Official systems have their own way of naming people, and it can feel impersonal. Yet behind that typed name was a daughter, a student, a friend, a girl whose Saturday should have remained ordinary. The quiet discipline of our retelling is to keep that human presence close. The family's responsibility was different. It was not professional, it was emotional, persistent, and unwanted. No family asks to become the keeper of a cold case. They become one because the official answer fails, or because no answer arrives, or because the person they lost remains frozen in public memory. Christie's family carried the long years because love often becomes endurance when there is nothing else it can do. Endurance has small textures. A photograph handled often enough that its corners soften, a newspaper clipping folded along the same crease. A phone call made to ask whether there is anything new. A silence at dinner when a date comes around again. You and I can imagine those textures without intruding on private grief. They are part of the atmosphere of every long unsolved case. The Christie Mullins case took shape across that endurance. It moved through courtrooms, police offices, family memories, and eventually cold case review. Each setting had its own sound. A courtroom with polished wood and murmured voices, a police records room with metal cabinets and fluorescent light, a family home with a chair pulled close to a table, a modern office where an old file is scanned into a newer system. These places do not seem connected until the case makes them connected. A single name moves through them. Christie Mullins. The name appears in official documents and private conversations. It is spoken by detectives, relatives, writers, and reporters. Over decades, it gathers different tones: grief, doubt, frustration, patience, and finally, a quieter form of acknowledgement. You can feel that tonal change when the case moves from the 1970s into the 2000s. The earliest records have the urgency of response. The middle years have the dull ache of uncertainty. The later records have the careful language of review. Each period adds its own layer. A cold case file is not one voice, it is a small archive of changing voices. One voice belongs to the law. It says conviction, acquittal, evidence, finding. Another belongs to the family. It says Christie, daughter, memory, why. Another belongs to the wrongly accused. It says I did not do this, even when the record once said otherwise. Another belongs to the cold case detective. It says let us read again. Let us test what was accepted. Let us correct what can be corrected. That last voice is the one beside us tonight. It is not the loudest voice. It is the most patient. You can imagine it speaking in an office after everyone else has gone home, not to perform certainty, but to keep the work moving. A detective reads one more paragraph, checks one more date, compares one more name. Outside the room, the building grows quiet. In the Christie Mullins case, patience meant accepting that the final answer would not come with every ordinary form of justice. Henry Newell was dead. There could be no trial in which his responsibility was publicly argued. There could be no sentencing. The case could be closed but not completed in the way families often hope. That incompleteness is part of the file's final texture. You and I should not try to smooth that texture away. It matters that justice came late. It matters that the person named was beyond the reach of court. It matters that Jack Carman had already suffered wrongful blame. It matters that Christie's family waited through years that no announcement could return. Solved does not mean unharmed. It means the central question has been answered as far as the record allows. The word solved then becomes gentler here. It is not a bright word. It is a settled word, or partly settled. It means the detectives believed they had reached the person responsible. It means the old false answer was replaced. It means the public record changed. It does not mean the sadness ended or that every silence was filled. If you are listening in the dark, maybe with the room around you soft and still, you can let that understanding be enough for now. The Christie Mullins case is not asking us for excitement. It is asking us for patience with imperfection. It is asking us to notice how truth can arrive late and still matter, how correction can be incomplete and still necessary. Correction is a quiet moral act. It says that the record is not only for the past, it is for everyone who will read it later. In Christie's case, correcting the record means that a future reader does not inherit the old false center. They inherit a more honest account, one that includes error and repair together. That is a gift to memory, even if it is a sorrowful one. You can imagine a future student or investigator opening the case for research. They see the first arrest, they see the conviction. They see the acquittal, they see the later conclusion naming Henry Newell. If the record is clear, they do not stop at the old confession. They understand the whole arc. That clarity prevents the past from misleading another generation. The physical record may still look ordinary. Folders, reports, photocopies, digital scans, perhaps news articles printed from archives. But inside that ordinariness is the slow turn from error to recognition. Old cases often hide their drama in paperwork. And we are not using the word drama as excitement tonight. We mean the human movement from not knowing to knowing, from wrong knowing to better knowing. The Christie Mullins case moved that way because people kept attention alive. It could have remained a confused file, remembered only by those closest to it. Instead, questions persisted. The question of Jack Carman's confession. The question of Henry Newell's role. The question of what Pam Brown had heard. The question of whether an old case could still be corrected after so many years. Questions, when held patiently, can be acts of care. They prevent false peace. They keep a case from being folded away too soon. They do not need to be shouted. The strongest questions in cold case work are often calm, repeated, and precise. What did this person actually know? Why did this statement matter? What evidence supports this conclusion? What was assumed instead of proved? You and I ask those questions softly as the night deepens. We ask them not because we distrust everyone, but because Christie deserved accuracy. Jack deserved accuracy. A community cannot learn from a case if the case remains wrapped around the wrong answer. The questions opened the wrapping. There is a sensory patience to questioning. The pencil pauses. The reader looks up at the wall for a moment. The file lies open, a little curved where the pages meet the spine. Dust catches in the light. The detective returns to the line again. This is how a question lives physically, not as an abstract thought, but as a body sitting with paper, air, silence, and time. In Christie's file, one question kept returning. Why was Henry Newell trusted as a witness? It is a simple question, but it contains the whole case. If his account had been treated with more skepticism, perhaps the sketch would have carried less authority. If the sketch had carried less authority, perhaps Jack Carman would not have been pulled in so quickly. If Jack had not been pulled in, perhaps the investigation would have stayed open in the right direction. We cannot rewrite that chain. We can only trace it. Tracing is not the same as changing, but it is not useless. Tracing shows where future investigators must be careful. It teaches that a helpful witness can still need scrutiny, that a confession can still be false, and that vulnerable people need protections strong enough to withstand pressure. The Christie Mullins case, because it took so long to correct, becomes a lesson with long shadows. Those shadows fall across interrogation rooms, witness interviews, composite sketches. They remind us that the desire for resolution can become dangerous when it outruns verification. They also remind us that patience, even late patience, can bring a case nearer to truth. The long passage of time did not make the truth easier to find in every way. It made many things harder. Memories faded, people died, evidence aged, the original scene changed. But time also loosened some loyalties and fears. It allowed a family member to speak. It allowed new investigators to see old assumptions more clearly. It allowed public understanding of false confessions to mature. This is one of the paradoxes of cold cases. Time both damages and reveals. It erodes tracks, but it may also erode lies. It dims memories, but it may soften fear enough for someone to speak. It removes suspects from the reach of court, but it may bring documents into the hands of people willing to read them differently. The Christie Mullins case lives inside that paradox. You can imagine time as a fine dust over the evidence box. At first, dust seems only to hide things, but when a careful hand wipes it away, the pattern beneath may appear more clearly than expected. The label is still there. The name is still there. The old date is still readable. The dust has not destroyed everything. It has only made patience necessary. Patience is the word we return to because this case keeps returning us to it. Patience from the family. Patience from later investigators. Patience from anyone trying to understand why the first answer failed. Even our listening tonight is patient. We are not hurrying toward a neat closing line. We are staying in the work, because the work itself is the story. The work included recentering the person who had been miscentered. Jack Carman's role in the file had to change. He could not remain the shadow suspect of public imagination. The cold case conclusion helped move him into the category that better fit the truth. A man with disabilities who was wrongly accused, wrongly convicted, later acquitted, and eventually publicly separated from Christie's death by the naming of Henry Newell. That movement is important. It shows that justice is not only about identifying guilt, it is also about removing guilt where it does not belong. A wrongful accusation is not a side issue, it is an injury to truth. When the Christie Mullins case was corrected, that correction served both Christie's memory and Jack's humanity. The two are not in conflict. Sometimes people think compassion must choose one person at a time. This case shows otherwise. We can have compassion for Christie's family and for Jack Carman. We can hold grief for the central loss and concern for the wrongful blame. We can recognize Henry Newell's responsibility without turning the story into cruelty. A careful retelling has room for all of that, because human truth is rarely narrow. The official cold case work also had to be narrow in a different sense. Investigators needed focus. They could not drift into every rumor or every speculation. They had to stay with what could be supported. That is another kind of patience. The patience not to overreach. Old mysteries invite imagination, but solving them requires restraint. You and I practice that restraint tonight. We do not invent scenes no one recorded. We do not fill Henry Newell's mind with thoughts we cannot know. We do not describe harm for its own sake. We stay with the evidence path, the known names, the years of waiting, and the way a late account connected with an old witness role. That is enough to understand the shape. The shape is steady now. Christie's case began with a terrible loss near Graceland Shopping Center. It turned towards Jack Carman through a sketch and a confession that later failed. It remained unsettled for decades. It returned to Henry Newell through family disclosure and cold case review. It was publicly corrected when police named Newell as responsible. The path is steady, but the emotions inside it are deep. Because we are continuing through the file rather than summarizing it, we can stay with those emotions one by one. First, the uncertainty. Uncertainty has its own sound in a family. It is the phone not ringing. It is the answer that never feels complete. It is the newspaper article clipped and saved because maybe one day someone will need it. It is the way a name can make a room go quiet. Then, the frustration. Frustration can be louder, but over years it often becomes low and constant. It sits behind conversations with officials. It appears when someone says the case was solved and the family does not believe it was. It rises when Jack Carman's confession is mentioned as though it settled everything. It is not dramatic in daily life. It is simply there. Then, the endurance. Endurance may be the quietest feeling of all. It does not announce itself. It gets up in the morning. It keeps documents. It answers questions. It waits through another year. It becomes part of the household air. In the Christie Mullins case, endurance lasted long enough for the official story to change. Finally, the correction. Correction can bring relief, but also renewed grief. When a family hears that the person responsible was someone else, someone present near the beginning, it may reopen the old wound in a different place. You and I can imagine that, carefully. An answer can soothe one part of the heart and ache in another. That is why we do not call it simple closure. The police announcement in 2015 offered a corrected answer, but it also confirmed that the truth had been missed for decades. That confirmation can be painful. It tells a family not only who was responsible, but how long the case lived under a wrong conclusion. It tells a wrongly accused person that the system finally sees what should have been seen earlier. It tells a department that its history includes harm. Yet the announcement still mattered. It mattered because silence would have been worse. Silence would have left the old confusion in place. Silence would have allowed Henry Newell's role to remain hidden behind the old witness label. Silence would have left Jack Carman's name more tangled than it needed to be. The corrected statement did not finish all healing, but it made healing more truthful. Truthful healing moves slowly. It does not erase contradiction. It allows people to say, this is what happened, this is what went wrong, and this is what we know now. The Christie Mullins case reached that point through patience. You can feel the age of the case in every phrase, but you can also feel the clarity that finally came through. The sensory world of the final review is likely less dramatic than people imagine. There may have been no dark archive with a single swinging bulb. More likely there were office lights, computers, phones, file cabinets, and the practical scent of copier toner. Someone may have eaten lunch at a desk. Someone may have taken notes during a call. Truth often arrives through ordinary rooms. That ordinariness is worth honoring. It means that patient detective work belongs to daily discipline, not cinematic brilliance. A person comes in, opens the file, reads carefully, calls someone, checks a statement, enters a note, and then does it again. The Christie Mullins case was not solved because one person had a magical insight. It was solved because enough people kept making room for the right question. The right question kept pointing back to Henry Newell. It pointed through his presence, his statement, his influence on the sketch, and the later report of his confession. The old case had placed him near the origin, the new review placed him near the answer. That movement from origin to answer is the central quiet arc of the case. You can trace it again with your hand resting lightly on the table. Newell speaks as a witness. The sketch points outward, Jack is drawn in, the confession fails. The case waits. Pam Brown speaks, detectives read again. Newell is named. Each step is connected, and each connection has a human cost. The line is simple only when the years have been compressed, but we are not compressing them tonight. We let the years remain wide. We let 1975 be its own room, with summer heat and typewriters and police notebooks. We let the late 1970s be another room, with court proceedings and the unraveling of Jack Carman's conviction. We let the long middle years be another, quieter room, where family doubt and old files kept breathing. We let 2013 and 2015 be rooms of disclosure and correction. Moving through those rooms slowly, you can sense how a case changes meaning depending on where you stand. In the first room, Henry Newell looks like a witness. In the second, Jack Carman looks like the failed suspect. In the middle room, the case looks unsettled. In the final review, Newell's earlier role looks different. The facts are linked, but perspective changes the pattern. Perspective is not the same as invention. It is the way truth becomes visible when enough surrounding light changes. A mountain looks different at dawn than at noon, though the mountain is the same. The Christie Mullins file looked different after the false confession was better understood, after Newell's niece spoke, and after cold case detectives brought modern caution to old assumptions. That modern caution is a form of humility. It says that a confession can be unreliable. It says that a witness can mislead. It says that a conviction can be wrong. It says that police work must be reviewed like any other human work. Humility does not weaken investigation. It strengthens it because it allows the investigator to follow facts rather than defend conclusions. You and I can rest in that idea for a while. Humility as strength. Patience as strength. Correction as strength. These are not loud virtues, but they are the virtues that solved the Christie Mullins case after so many years. They are also the virtues that make a late-night retelling gentle enough for rest, because they do not ask the listener to brace. They ask the listener to breathe. The file remains open in our imagined room. Perhaps the corner of one page lifts slightly in the air from a vent. Perhaps the lamp has warmed the surface of the desk. Perhaps your hand rests near the margin, where a detective once wrote a note. We are still beside the case, still reading, still letting the old paper speak in a voice low enough not to disturb the night. There is one more aspect of responsibility to consider, and it belongs to memory itself. Memory is not passive. What a community remembers shapes what it believes about justice, policing, victims, and error. If Christie's case were remembered only as a solved case from 1975, the error would vanish. If it were remembered only as a wrongful conviction, Christie might vanish. The fuller memory must hold both. Holding both is work. It requires language that does not simplify too quickly. Christie was the victim, Jack Carman was wrongly accused, Henry Newell was ultimately named as responsible, the investigation failed early and corrected itself late. The family waited. The case changed. Each sentence is plain, and each one keeps a different part of the truth from being lost. You can imagine memory as another kind of file cabinet, one not made of metal, but of stories repeated over time. When the wrong story is placed inside it, people keep opening the wrong drawer. Correcting a case means relabeling the drawer, moving the papers, and telling future readers where to look. It is quiet work, but without it, the past remains poorly arranged. The Christie Mullins case now sits in that cabinet differently. It is a story of patient detective work, yes, but also a warning about early certainty. It is a story of a family's persistence, but also of a niece's eventual disclosure. It is a story about old police work and newer review. It is a story about a young girl and the long effort to name the truth around her. As sleep begins to pull at the edges of attention, those storylines can blur softly without disappearing. You may remember the shopping center. You may remember the sketch. You may remember the false confession. You may remember the niece speaking after years. You may remember the cold case detectives reading again. That is enough. The file remains steady whether or not every detail stays awake in the mind. Still, we keep going because the script continues in the same quiet room. The next pages ask us to sit not with what was discovered, but with how an old case feels after the answer has finally been spoken, not ended, not erased, only spoken, carefully, into the record after years of being withheld by error, fear, and time. When an answer is spoken late, the air around it can feel strangely still. There may be relief, but not the kind that lifts everything. There may be sorrow, but not the same sorrow as before. There may be anger, but it has a clearer address now. You and I can imagine Christie's family receiving the official conclusion with all those feelings braided together, none of them cancelling the others. A family can be grateful for truth and wounded by delay. A person wrongly accused can be relieved by correction and still hurt by what correction cannot restore. A detective can be satisfied that the case has been clarified and sober about the failures that made clarification necessary. These mixed feelings are not contradictions. They are the natural weather of late justice. Weather is a useful image here, because old cases have climates. The Christie Mullins case began in summer heat. It moved through the cold storage of official uncertainty. It returned under the cooler light of review. And when the answer came, it did not arrive like a storm breaking. It arrived like a long overcast sky beginning slowly to show some contour in the clouds. You can feel that contour in the corrected narrative. Henry Newell is no longer a vague figure on the edge. Jack Carman is no longer the center. Christie's family is no longer asked to live with the first answer. The case is not perfect, but it is clearer. Clarity can be gentle. It can be enough light to walk by, even if it is not full daylight. The police announcement also returned attention to the dangers of false confession, especially for people with cognitive limitations. That lesson extends beyond Christie's file. It asks investigators everywhere to slow down when a confession appears too easily, to ask whether the person understands, to seek corroboration, and to remember that a statement can be shaped by fear, confusion, or the desire to please. In this way, one old case can teach future care. We do not need to turn Christie's story into a lecture. The lesson is already inside the facts. Jack Carman confessed, but the confession was not truth. Henry Newell gave a witness account, but the account did not lead to truth. Later review, supported by a family statement and a more careful reading of the file, corrected the case. The lesson sits quietly there, waiting for anyone responsible for an investigation to notice. You and I notice it tonight as part of the same slow attention. We notice the way systems depend on the quality of listening. We notice the way a vulnerable person can be overwhelmed. We notice the way a confident witness can steer attention. We notice the way families can sense a wrongness that takes years to be formally acknowledged. None of those observations require raised voices. They only require that we stay present. The file's physical presence helps us stay present. Think of the faint indentation left by old typewriter keys on a page, the uneven darkness where a ribbon struck harder on some letters than others. Think of the smooth plastic sleeve around a photograph, slightly cloudy from age. Think of the cool metal drawer sliding open. These small textures anchor the story so it does not become only an idea. In the Christie Mullins case, those textures belong to a file that traveled through eras of police work. From typewritten reports to digital records, from old interview practices to newer caution, from local newspaper updates to online archives. The case crossed from one world into another, carrying with it the unresolved question of who should have been named from the start. Crossing eras can make old cases feel fragile. A document may be copied so many times that its edges blur. A witness's address may no longer exist. A detective's notes may refer to people who have died. Yet crossing eras can also make old cases stronger. because the later era brings new concepts, new accountability, and new willingness to revisit what was once considered settled. That willingness is central. Without willingness, the Christie Mullins case might have remained officially confused, its corrected answer known only in scattered pieces or private suspicion. Willingness opened the file again. Willingness listened to Pam Brown. Willingness reconsidered Henry Newell. Willingness publicly separated Jack Carman from the guilt once placed on him. You can hear the softness in that word, willingness. It does not sound dramatic. It sounds like a door being opened during quiet hours. It sounds like someone saying, "Let us look again." Many cold cases depend on that sentence. Let us look again. It is one of the most hopeful sentences in patient detective work, because it admits that the past may still be met with care, but looking again is not the same as looking endlessly. A case also needs resolution when the evidence supports it. The cold case detectives reached the point where they believed the file, the later disclosure, and the corrected understanding of Jack Carman's confession all pointed to Henry Newell. At that point, responsibility required them to say so. Silence would have preserved ambiguity past its usefulness. Ambiguity can be honest for a time, but when a careful review has made the answer strong enough, continuing to speak as if all possibilities are equal can become its own form of dishonesty. The Christie Mullins case needed the courage not only to doubt the old answer, but to name the new one. That is a different kind of courage, quieter than the first, but no less real. You and I sit with that courage in the low light. It is the courage of correction after embarrassment, the courage of admitting a vulnerable man was wronged, the courage of telling a family that the truth was missed for decades, the courage of naming a dead man when the evidence points there, even though no courtroom can now test him. Each form of courage carries its own weight. Weight is another word that belongs to this file. The physical weight of folders, the emotional weight of waiting, the professional weight of signing a conclusion, the public weight of changing a case's story. If you imagine lifting the Christie Mullins file box, it might not be heavy in the arms, but it would be heavy in meaning. Some boxes are like that. They weigh more after they are opened. And now, with the box open, the next part of our quiet sitting turns toward the long middle years. The years when the case seemed to wait without moving, though beneath the surface memory was still gathering what the file would one day need.